Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. How's everybody doing? We're going to do a quick review. Chapter 16 of the Autobiography of Malcolm X, as told to Alex Haley. Title of Chapter 16 is out. In 1961, Mr. Muhammad's condition of coughing grew worse. He would unpredictably cough harder and harder. The Muslims in the nation knew it was something serious if they had to cancel appearances. Malcolm says, quote, Muslims knew that only something really serious would ever have stopped the messenger from keeping his promise to be with them at their rallies, end quote. Losing Mr. Muhammad at the time could have destroyed the nation. Malcolm says, quote, we Muslims regarded ourselves as moral and mental spiritual examples for other black Americans because we followed the personal example of Mr. Muhammad, end quote. He talks about how Mr. Muhammad would readily punish his officials. He says, quote, Mr. Muhammad said that any defecting official betrayed both himself and his position as a leader and example for other Muslims, end quote. To help with Mr. Muhammad's health, the nation found him a home in Phoenix. And the home was being sold by a saxophone player, Louis Jordan. Malcolm says, quote, I had helped bring about the progress and national impact such that none could call us liars when we called Mr. Muhammad the most powerful black man in America, end quote. Malcolm felt that the Nation of Islam had more potential. He says, quote, if I harbored any personal disappointment whatsoever, it was that privately I was convinced that our Nation of Islam could be an even greater force in the American black man's overall struggle if we engaged in more action, end quote. The Negro community would say, quote, those Muslims talk tough, but they never do anything unless somebody bothers Muslims, end quote. Malcolm was involved in laying the foundation for the Nation of Islam. He says, quote, I had either directly established or helped to establish most of the 100 or more mosques in the 50 states. End quote. He maintained a marathon schedule with press, radio, television, and public speaking. In 1961, Malcolm talks about the jealousy that Mr. Muhammad prophesied of. Things like, quote, Mr. Malcolm is trying to take over the nation, end quote. Comments like this made Malcolm more dedicated to make sure those things never came true. Non-Muslims thought Malcolm made money, but it was all through the Nation of Islam. Everything that he owned, his car, his house, it was all owned by the Nation of Islam. Malcolm only had one argument with his wife, Betty, and it was about money. Betty felt Malcolm should put some money away for the family. Malcolm says, quote, I knew I had in Betty a wife who would sacrifice her life for me if such an occasion ever presented itself to her. But still, I told her that too many organizations have been destroyed by leaders who tried to benefit personally, often goaded into it by their wives, end quote. This argument almost caused them to separate, and Malcolm told Betty that if anything ever happened to him, the Nation of Islam would take care of her and their children. Malcolm talks about how he always tried to give credit to Elijah Muhammad during any interview. He would say, quote, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches, end quote. He tried to tell reporters that, quote, all Muslims are number 2 after Mr. Muhammad, end quote. He encouraged reporters to meet Mr. Muhammad and tried to deflect the attention, saying all praise is due to Allah. In 1966, Malcolm noticed he was featured less in Muhammad Speaks. Mr. Muhammad's son, Herbert, told them not to talk about Malcolm. Malcolm was eventually blacked out from the paper. Malcolm loved the nation and Mr. Muhammad. Malcolm felt that Mr. Muhammad couldn't be running all over the country, and whoever he appointed as the spokesman would get a lot of press. Malcolm says if he felt any resentment, that was weakness in itself. During 1963, Malcolm says he became more sensitive to his critics within the Nation of Islam. Malcolm felt that the Muslims in Chicago were jealous of his popularity. He talks about, he mentions that he wanted to speak about Medgar Evers and the Birmingham church bombing. Mr. Muhammad made Malcolm the nation's first national minister. In late 1963 in Philadelphia, Mr. Muhammad told the audience, quote, "This is my most faithful, hard-working minister. He will follow me until he dies, end quote. This was Malcolm and Mr. Muhammad's last public appearance together. Malcolm says that before that, there was a $10,000 reward for Malcolm's death in Louisiana. Malcolm says, quote, the threat of death was much closer to me than somewhere in Louisiana, end quote. Malcolm says that in the 12 years as a Muslim minister, he taught on moral issues and was accused of being anti-women. He says, quote, the very keel of my teaching and my most bone-deep personal belief was that Elijah Muhammad, in every aspect of his existence, was a symbol of moral, mental, and spiritual reform among the American black people, end quote. Malcolm felt that he was the best example of Elijah Muhammad's ability to reform. Malcolm never touched a woman in his 12 years from prison to marriage. Malcolm says around 1963, he spoke less of religion and taught social doctrine. He says his faith was shaken when he discovered Muslims were betrayed by Elijah Muhammad himself. On July 3rd, 1963, LA Press reported that Elijah Muhammad faced paternity suits from two former secretaries who he had fathered, who said he fathered 4 children. Both women were in their 20s, Miss Williams and Miss Rosary. Malcolm had heard hints since 1955, but he feared the idea of Mr. Muhammad being immoral and refused to accept Mr. Muhammad being accused of adultery. He says, quote, one of the nation's most closely kept scandals was that a succession of the personal secretaries of Mr. Muhammad had become pregnant. They confessed to adultery before the Muslim courts. They were sentenced to 5 years of isolation. Malcolm says, quote, I don't think I could say anything which better testifies of my faith in Mr. Muhammad that absolutely rejected my own intelligence he says, quote, I don't think I could say anything which better testifies of my faith in Mr. Muhammad that that he absolutely rejected his own intelligence, end quote. By late 1962, Malcolm learned that many Muslims were leaving the Chicago mosque. He says, quote, when I thought how the press constantly sought ways to discredit the Nation of Islam, I trembled to think of such a thing reaching the ears of some newspaper reporter, either black or white, end quote. Malcolm felt like a fool to travel around praising Mr. Muhammad while these accusations were occurring right under his nose. Malcolm felt that Elijah Muhammad raised him from the dead, and he didn't want to let him down. Malcolm went to see the son of Elijah Muhammad, Wallace Muhammad. Malcolm felt that Wallace was, quote, Mr. Muhammad's most strongly spiritual son, the son with the most objective outlook, end quote. Then Malcolm broke the rule of not speaking to isolated Muslims. He spoke with 3 of the former secretaries of Mr. Muhammad. They told him that Elijah Muhammad fathered their children and that he felt Malcolm was... They told him that Elijah Muhammad fathered their children and that he felt Malcolm was dangerous. He says, quote, I learned from these former secretaries of Mr. Muhammad that while he was praising me to my face, he was tearing me apart behind my back. Malcolm also tried to find a case in the Quran or Bible to show that a man's accomplishments outweigh his weaknesses. David's adultery with Bathsheba is overshadowed by his triumph over Goliath. Malcolm flew to Phoenix in 1963 to see Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm says, quote, he was the man who trained me, who had treated me as if I were his own flesh and blood. He was the man who had given me wings to go places, to do things I otherwise never would have dreamed of, end quote. Mr. Muhammad told Malcolm, quote, I'm David. When you read about how David took another man's wife, I'm that David. You read about how Noah who got drunk, that's me. You read about Lot who went and laid with his own daughters. I have to fulfill all those things, end quote. Malcolm told some of the East Coast officials about the affair in order to prepare them on how to respond, but Chicago Muslims felt that he was making the situation worse. He says, quote, hating on me was going to become the cause for people of shattered faith to rally around, end quote. Then JFK was assassinated in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. Mr. Muhammad had 2 directives. Every Muslim was ordered to make no remarks concerning the assassination, and if asked, they should say no comment. Mr. Muhammad canceled his plans to speak at the Manhattan Center in New York and sent Malcolm instead. His speech was prepared a week in advance, and it was about God's judgment of America. At the question and answer period, he was asked his thoughts about Kennedy's assassination. Instead of saying no comment, he said it was a case of, quote, the chickens coming home to roost, end quote. He compared Kennedy's assassination to Medgar Evers and Patrice Lumumba. When he went to see Mr. Muhammad, he knew and he knew that America loved Kennedy. Mr. Muhammad said, quote, I have to silence you for 90 days so that Muslims everywhere can disassociate with this blunder, end quote. Malcolm told Mr. Muhammad, quote, sir, I agree with you and I submit 100%, end quote. But the Nation of Islam was implying that he had not submit, and Malcolm felt he was being set up. Malcolm went to the doctor to get his brain scanned, and the doctor recommended rest. Malcolm was invited to Miami by Cassius Clay. This was Malcolm and Betty's 6th wedding anniversary. This was January 1964. Malcolm says, quote, I was in a state of emotional shock. I was like someone who for 12 years had an inseparable, beautiful marriage, and then suddenly one morning at breakfast, the marriage partner had thrust across the table some divorce papers, end quote. Malcolm felt that the chickens coming home to roost comment was an excuse to get him out. He says that it was a plan which final step included, quote, step 3 would be either to provoke some Muslim ignorant of the truth to take it upon himself to kill me as a religious duty, or to isolate me, that I would gradually disappear from the public scene, end quote. Malcolm didn't fear death and was ready to lay down his life for Elijah Muhammad. He felt that betrayal was worse than death. Malcolm says, quote, if Mr. Muhammad had committed any civil crime punishable by death, I would have said and tried to prove that I did it to save him, and I would have gone to the electric chair as Mr. Muhammad's servant, end quote. He says, quote, because I actually had believed that if Mr. Muhammad was not God, he surely stood next to God, end quote. Malcolm says, quote, what began to break my faith was that try as I might, I couldn't evade that Mr. Muhammad, instead of facing what he had done before his followers as a human weakness or as a fulfillment of prophecy, which I sincerely believe that Muslims would have understood or at least would have accepted, Mr. Muhammad had instead been willing to hide to cover up what he had done, end quote. This is when Malcolm first began to realize that he believed in Mr. Muhammad more than Mr. Muhammad believed in himself. Malcolm told Cassius Clay that his fight with Sonny Liston was, quote, the cross and the crescent, fighting in a prize ring for the first time, since Cassius was a Muslim and Sonny was a Christian. Malcolm felt Sonny Liston was fighting harder to integrate than training to fight Cassius. Malcolm says the first direct order for my death was issued through Mosque number 7 from a previous close assistant. Another assistant was assigned to blow up his car, but instead he told Malcolm about the plan. Malcolm says, quote, this first direct death order was how finally I began to arrive at my psychological divorce from the Nation of Islam, end quote. Malcolm began to observe people that he knew would try to put a bullet in him. Malcolm didn't know what to do. He knew that he was regarded as a leader of the black man's struggle. He had attacked many so-called black leaders for their shortcomings, and he wasn't sure what he could offer in regards to the human rights struggle. He knew that a good organizer needed to be able to analyze facts, analyze cold facts. He's talking about statistics. Malcolm knew he had the asset of an international image. He knew he had a presence in New York City from the police incident involving Brother Hinton. He speaks about the deputy chief inspector at the 28th precinct who said, quote, no man should have that much power, end quote. Malcolm talked about the ability he had to draw large crowds. He says, quote, I knew that in any society, a true leader is one who earns and deserves the following he enjoys. The followers are bestowed by themselves out of their own volition and emotions, end quote. Malcolm felt that the big-name Negroes of the 60s were so busy integrating with whites that they lost their rapport with the ghetto Negroes. Malcolm believed he had a ghetto instinct. He says, quote, I had a ghetto insight. For instance, I could feel if tension was beyond normal in a ghetto audience, end quote. Malcolm felt he could speak and understand the ghetto language. He says, quote, I know better than all whites know, and better than nearly all of the black leaders knew, that actually the most dangerous black man in America was the ghetto hustler, end quote. Malcolm felt that as hustlers in the ghetto had less respect for the white structure than any other Negro in North America, the ghetto hustler had no restraint of religion, morality, or civic responsibility, or fear. Malcolm felt a challenge to plan and build an organization that could help cure the black man in North America. He says, quote, the black man in North America was spiritually sick in his cooperative, sheep-like acceptance of the white man's culture. He compared blacks in America to a tick on a cow. Malcolm says, quote, it's because black men don't own and control their own communities' retail establishments that they can't stabilize their own community, end quote. Malcolm says, quote, whenever any group can vote in a block and decide the outcomes of elections, and it fails to do this, then that group is politically sick, end quote. He says, quote, U.S. politics is ruled by special interest blocks and lobbies. What group has more urgent special interests? What group needs a block, a lobby, more than the black man, end quote. Malcolm concludes, quote, the cornerstone of this country's operations are economic and political strength and power. The black doesn't have the economic strength, and it will take time to build it. But right now, the American black man has the political strength and power to change its destiny overnight, end quote. Malcolm knew that his plans to create for the American black man to gain his human rights and to cure his mental, spiritual, economic, and political sickness was a big task. He says, quote, if you ever intend to do anything worthwhile, you have to start with a worthwhile plan, end quote. Malcolm got support from many Negroes and held the first meeting at Teresa Hotel. He says, quote, numerous people have said the Nation of Islam's stringent moral restrictions revealed them. He says, quote, numerous people said that the Nation of Islam's stringent moral restrictions restrained them or revealed them, and they wanted, okay, so it says, numerous people have said that the Nation of Islam's stringent moral restrictions revealed them, and they wanted to join Malcolm. Some Negroes believed that the Nation of Islam was inactive and moving too slow. Whites couldn't join, but they could support financially. He announced the opening of Muslim Mosque Incorporated in New York City. This would be the religious base and spiritual force of the organization. Malcolm said, quote, Muslim Mosque Incorporated will have its temporary headquarters in the Hotel Teresa in Harlem. It would be the working base for an action program designed to eliminate the political oppression, economic exploitation, and social degradation suffered daily by 22 million Afro-Americans. But Malcolm knew that there were Muslims in the nation that would feel like a hero if they killed Malcolm. Malcolm says, quote, I knew that no one would kill you quicker than a Muslim if he felt that's what Allah wanted him to do, end quote. Malcolm felt that there was one thing he needed to do to prepare to build the organization, but he couldn't afford it. So he went back to Boston to visit his older sister Ella for money to make a trip to Mecca. And that's the end of chapter 16. Make sure you share this video if you like what you heard. Comment if you disagree with anything. Read the chapter and read the book for yourself. Thank you for coming through, and I will see y'all soon in chapter 17. Thank you.